Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking some really big ideas from Ray Dalio's The Changing World Order. We're going to look at a powerful and honestly kind of terrifying framework that helps explain the massive shifts happening all around us. So, does it ever just feel like the ground is shifting right under your feet? With all the political fighting, the economic craziness, and rising tensions around the globe, it's easy to feel like we are in completely uncharted territory. But what if we're not? What if all this chaos is actually part of a pattern that's been repeating for centuries? Well, this is where Ray Dalio's big idea comes in. He basically says we're so focused on our own day-to-day lives that we completely miss the forest for the trees. We don't see these huge, almost mechanical forces of history that are always at play. Forces that have literally shaped the rise and fall of every major empire for the last 500 years. And that brings us to the absolute core of his argument. The rise and fall of great powers isn't just random. Nope. He says it follows a predictable template that he calls the big cycle. And after studying history, he found that these cycles tend to last around 250 years, give or take, and they're always driven by a few powerful, timeless forces. Dalio didn't just pull this out of thin air. He studied every major empire, from the Dutch to the British to the Americans, and he discovered that the same three forces consistently drive this cycle. They basically create the rhythm of history. So let's break them down. First up, you've got the money and debt cycle. Just think of this as the economic engine of a country. For about 50 to 100 years, credit gets easier and easier to get, which fuels all this prosperity. But eventually, the debt grows way too big, it creates a bubble, and then a bust. And that leads to a really painful period where everyone is forced to pay down their debts, which completely reshapes the whole economy. Okay, so force number 2, the internal order cycle. All those economic booms and busts, they create these huge gaps between the rich and the poor. And when that gap between the haves and the have-nots gets too big, especially when times are tough, society itself starts to fray. That's when you see populism rise, politics get super polarized, and people start fighting, really fighting, over who gets the wealth and power. And third, you have the external order cycle. So while the dominant power is dealing with all its debt and internal fighting, a new rival starts to emerge on the world stage. This rising power is usually more innovative, more economically dynamic, and it starts to challenge the old guard. And that leads to conflicts over trade, over technology, and ultimately over who's going to be in charge of the world. So that's the theory. But how does this cycle actually play out in the real world? Well, let's take a look at the very first modern global empire, the Dutch. Their story, their rise and their fall, is the perfect example of this entire big cycle. Okay, so picture this. In the late 1500s, the Dutch were just this tiny upstart nation, but they came up with these incredible innovations, especially in shipbuilding, and built a fleet that just came to dominate the seas. This led them to create the Dutch East India Company, which was basically the world's first multinational corporation, and it turned Amsterdam into the undisputed financial hub of the world. For a while, the Dutch guilder was the world's reserve currency, just like the US dollar is for us today. And you can see right here just how powerful that combination was. It created this amazing feedback loop. Their dominance in world trade fueled investment in new inventions, and that, in turn, made their financial power even stronger. This mix of commercial, tech, and financial strength, it's the classic recipe for a global empire. But as the cycle teaches us, what goes up must come down. And the very same forces that build an empire are the ones that eventually lead to its decline. For the Dutch, they got less competitive, their workers became more expensive, and they started taking on way too much debt just to keep up their standard of living. The story of the Dutch East India Company just captures this decline perfectly. I mean, it started with these incredible profits, right? So that attracted a flood of investment, creating this massive stock bubble. But then, as Dutch competitiveness started to slip and the company wasn't as strong, it just took on more and more debt until, finally, boom, the bubble burst and it wiped out fortunes. It's a classic story we've seen again and again. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some one-off thing with the Dutch. The British Empire, which rose up to challenge and eventually replace them, followed the exact same pattern. They innovated, they dominated trade, they made the pound sterling the new reserve currency. And then, just like the Dutch, they faced crushing debt, internal fighting, and the challenge of new rising powers. See the pattern? And this illustrates the final and frankly the most brutal phase of the cycle. You see, the transition of power is rarely peaceful. World War II was the violent end of this cycle, marking the decline of the British Empire and the rise of the American one. And you can literally see it reflected in the stock markets. After the big turning point in 1942, Allied markets soared because victory seemed likely, while Axis markets, well, they were eventually wiped out. War is the ultimate and most brutal reset of wealth and power. So, all of this history brings us to the most important question of all. Where are we now? Using Dalio's framework, let's take a look at the dynamic between the current dominant power, the United States, and the main rising power, China. Okay, one of the clearest signs of a power shift is always trade. For decades, the US was the undisputed center of global trade. I mean, it wasn't even close. But just look at this chart. In a stunningly short amount of time, that has completely flipped. China is now the #1 trading partner for way more countries than the US is. That's a classic sign of a shift in the external order. But it's not just about trade. It's also about people, what we call human capital. Now look at this data comparing the US and China since 1980. Sure, the US has seen some steady progress, which is great, but the growth in China has been absolutely explosive on every single metric. But the most telling number here, check out STEM majors, the engineers and scientists who literally build the future. That number has skyrocketed in China, from just 1 million to over 21 million. That's nearly triple the US total. That is a foundational investment in future power. Now, it is really important to get this straight. Dalio is very clear that this framework isn't a prophecy. It's not a crystal ball. It's a map. The point isn't that the past is doomed to repeat itself exactly. The whole point is that by understanding the mechanics that drove these cycles before, we can do a much better job of navigating the road ahead. Because, as they say, while history doesn't repeat, it sure does rhyme. So let's just boil it all down, shall we? The crucial takeaway here is that history isn't just a bunch of random events. There appears to be a predictable big cycle, driven by debt, internal conflict, and external challenges that is repeated for centuries. And understanding this framework gives us a really powerful lens to view the world, especially today. And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? If you look at Dalio's metrics, the United States is showing all the classic signs of a late cycle empire: really high debt, deep internal divisions, and a very formidable external challenger. And at the same time, China is showing all the signs of a rising power. Now, knowing the mechanics of the cycle doesn't tell us exactly what's going to happen, but it definitely tells us what to watch for. So if this cycle holds true, what does the next chapter of our changing world order actually look like?